Owlpen Manor, Gloucestershire, England. Hidden deep within a secluded Cotswold valley stands a manor that seems almost untouched by time. Parts of Owlpen Manor have stood for centuries, watching generations of families, servants and visitors pass through its doors. But its beautiful Tudor exterior hides a much darker reputation. Stories tell of a grey lady, a mysterious hooded figure, and even the apparition of a child watching from an empty house. Some believe Owlpen isn't simply preserving its history. They believe its history is still walking the corridors. Owlpen's history stretches deep into medieval England. The Owlpen family held the estate before it passed through marriage to the Daunt family in the 15th century. The manor developed over generations, with its Tudor hall and later 1616 west wing creating much of the extraordinary building that survives today. But after the death of Thomas Daunt in 1777, the old manor was eventually left largely unoccupied and slipped into decay. For decades, it sat almost forgotten beneath enormous yew trees, earning comparisons to a sleeping beauty, before architect Norman Jewson rescued and restored it in the 1920s. Yet according to local legend, the empty manor may never truly have been empty. Perhaps the most famous apparition associated with Owlpen Manor is its mysterious Grey Lady. Tradition identifies her as Margaret of Anjou, wife of King Henry VI, who is said to have stayed at Owlpen during the turmoil surrounding the Wars of the Roses. Ghost stories describe a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing, appearing inside the manor before mysteriously vanishing. Over time, believers came to associate the figure with Margaret, creating the legend of a defeated medieval queen returning to a place connected with one of the darkest periods of her life. Whether the apparition really represents Margaret is impossible to establish, but the Grey Lady remains one of Owlpen Manor's defining ghost stories. The Grey Lady isn't the only presence said to inhabit Owlpen. Another legend describes a dark hooded apparition sometimes called the Black Monk. One version of the story identifies him as Bartholomew de Owlpen and claims he was sealed behind a wall and left to die. The tale becomes even more disturbing. Later versions claim human remains were eventually discovered inside the manor, only to crumble when exposed. It's a dramatic story, but one that belongs firmly to Owlpen's folklore rather than its documented architectural history. Reports nevertheless continue to associate a mysterious hooded figure with the property. Imagine turning a corner in this centuries-old house and finding a silent hooded figure waiting in the darkness. Perhaps Owlpen's eeriest story involves something far less threatening at first glance. A young child has reportedly been seen looking from one of the manor's windows, even when nobody should have been there. There's an interesting piece of real history behind Owlpen's association with children too. Accounts of the property's past record that children evacuated from British cities during the Second World War stayed at Owlpen. That doesn't prove any connection to the apparition, of course. But combine the child at the window with stories of the Grey Lady and the Black Monk, and Owlpen begins to feel less like an abandoned old house, and more like a place where different centuries somehow overlap. A medieval estate hidden in an isolated valley, a manor that stood largely unoccupied for decades, a Grey Lady traditionally identified as Margaret of Anjou, a sinister hooded figure lurking within the folklore, and a mysterious child reportedly watching from an empty window. Owlpen Manor doesn't need ruined walls or abandoned corridors to feel unsettling. Its isolation, remarkable age and centuries of stories give it an atmosphere all its own, for history, legend and sheer paranormal reputation. But here's the question: if you were completely alone inside Owlpen Manor after midnight and saw a child's face staring at you from an upstairs window, would you go inside to find them? Would you spend the night alone inside Owlpen Manor? Tell me in the comments, and follow NightmareHarbinger as we uncover more of Britain's darkest history, terrifying legends and most haunted locations.